Now that we've finished the Korean War, and we're going to talk a little bit about the end of the Korean War here, but now that we've looked at the Korean War, we're going to look at Eisenhower, then we'll look at JFK and a little bit at Johnson, but Johnson will mostly be in our next unit. So we're going to look at these guys and their pieces and their actions in the Cold War. So we first have to look at leadership. And so we want to talk about the U.S. In 1952, Eisenhower, who is a Republican, becomes the next president. Richard Nixon is his vice president. As vice president, Nixon gets some political clout and gets heard. And actually, as we know, Nixon's going to become president later on. He obviously is not the next president because the next one's JFK, as I already said, but Nixon is coming up. And in the Soviet Union and Russia, Stalin died in 1953, and eventually, after a couple of years of some upheaval in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev becomes the next president of the Soviet Union, or the Soviet premier. So now we're looking at Eisenhower and Khrushchev, and the two of them are going to be dealing with one another. So here we have Eisenhower and Nixon, and I really love the button. I like Ike. That was his slogan and what he ran on, and people really liked Eisenhower. And we know Eisenhower was a general before this, and people really associated him with that winning World War II. This is Nikita Khrushchev, so that kind of gives you a visual of what he looked like. So Eisenhower comes in and he continues to practice containment. So he doesn't get rid of it, but he does add to it with the Eisenhower Doctrine. It's added in 1957, specifically about the Middle East. The idea is that Eisenhower promises military support or monetary aid if a country wants to resist armed aggression from another country. So specifically looking at the Middle East and saying if communism is trying to spread into your country, so we're looking at the Middle East, we know that up here north of Turkey, that we can't really see, is where the Soviet Union is. So they're trying to move into the warm water ports. Remember, we already talked about Greece and Turkey here. So if any of these countries feel like they want to keep the Soviet Union out, they ask for our help, we will help them. And that is the Eisenhower Doctrine, specifically help in the Middle East. Another policy that Eisenhower promotes is massive retaliation, also sometimes known as total retaliation. You'll see it as both. Basically, the idea is that Korea really was not popularly supported. It cost a lot of money, it cost a lot of lives. So Eisenhower saw this as really a failure. And if we look at it, we really didn't gain anything and we lost a whole lot. So expensive, unpopular, let's not have, excuse me, let's not have a lot more of these small wars. Instead, let's believe in massive retaliation using nuclear weapons to combat the spread of communism. A couple of you really support that. You keep asking why we don't use nukes. So this actually allows us to cut military costs, but because we don't have to pay for the military itself, the manpower and things like that, those sustainable costs, instead we just stockpile nuclear weapons. This is going to be the start of the arms race because communist countries don't want us, specifically the Soviet Union, don't want us to have more weapons than they do. So they start stockpiling as well. So the idea that we will use all force necessary, which of course means nuclear weapons. This leads into this idea of brinkmanship and this name, John Foster Dulles. He is the Secretary of State under Eisenhower. He comes up with it kind of to support massive retaliation and in connection with it. Brinkmanship promotes going to the brink or the edge of war. So we're going to force the other side to back down by going to the brink. So this is Dulles, the ability to get to the verge without getting into the war. That's brinkmanship. So that's kind of what he's talking about. If you're scared to go to the brink, you will lose. So Dulles really promotes this, and it really ties in with the idea of massive retaliation. We're willing to do it. We're willing to go to the brink. We're willing to do what's necessary. And if we have to, we will use nuclear weapons. So Eisenhower actually does go to the brink a few times. Sputnik is not one of those cases, but there are times where he does. So now you ask, what is Sputnik? What is happening here? Well, Sputnik is actually the first satellite in outer space. It is Russian. The Soviets launched the first satellite. It can't do anything but transmit a radio signal. It doesn't do anything. But the idea is that if you can launch a missile from a satellite, if you can use these intercontinental ballistic missiles, if you can figure out how to do it from space, you can launch it anywhere in the world. So that idea that our missiles only reach so far will not exist anymore if we can do this. So it's very scary to the US. So we respond by creating NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and begin the space race. Who can get to, well, we've got space first with Sputnik. Who can get a man in space first? Also won by the Soviets. Then it's a man on the moon. So we just continue who can stay up longest, who can do this, who can do that. So we're constantly competing with the Soviets, and Sputnik kind of starts that whole space race, and we start putting money into that, and it ties in with keeping your country safe and your area of the world safe, stopping the spread of communism, stopping them from attacking us. So as you can see here, I mean, the satellite was almost nothing, but we have red moon over London. Russia wins the race to outer space. Satellite heard by Americans. Space age is here. Up goes a man-made moon. Like, we see all of these different, Russia launches Sputnik, all these different things. It was huge news. It was enormous because somebody had made it to outer space. So then Eisenhower has to deal with the next piece, the Suez Crisis. So all of these are happening during his presidency. He did serve 2 terms. The Suez Crisis has to do with Egypt. So if we go to our map here, the Suez Canal is right here. It was built by France and Great Britain in Egypt. So Egypt is not only here, but it's also this little piece over here, divided by the canal. Now, the idea here is that if you are trying to transport things, say from London, I'm going to pull up a different pen here for a second. So from London, from anywhere in Europe, France, wait, that was Spain, France, let me actually choose France here. You could either go all the way around Africa to get to, say, India, or if we wanted to go over to China, this time India would be the big one, or you could take a shortcut through this canal that they built. Look at how much shorter that is. Think about how much time that would save. So as we think about that, and they do that, we realize it is so much faster to go through the canal. So you can understand why they want to keep control of the canal. In 1956, Egyptian troops actually seized the canal, so they attacked it. They had the support of the Soviet Union in this. So Britain and France attack Egypt. They're fighting over the canal. The Soviets threaten to bomb. So we've got Britain and France attacking Egypt, Soviets threatening to bomb Britain and France. The U.S. is getting pulled in. The U.S. actually prepares for a nuclear attack under Eisenhower. He's ready, but we don't really want to do it. So he talks to the 2 sides, gets Britain and France not to invade Egypt, and essentially this is a win for the Soviets. So other Middle Eastern countries actually start to accept Soviet support. Kind of ends up being a loss for the U.S. because our side seemed to back down. So here you can kind of see the Suez Canal, troops that moved in. Israel is controlled by Britain at this time, so they moved in. So here you can kind of see the canal a little better. Now, also under Eisenhower, we have some issues with spying. Now, today we use spying. We've used spying throughout history. Washington used spying in the Revolutionary War. This is not something new, but Eisenhower believed covert operations, not just spying, would help further American policies. He used these in Guatemala. He used them in Iran. Sometimes they worked better than others, and we were able to get pro-American governments in place, and sometimes they didn't. In 1960, it didn't work out too well for the U.S. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. The pilot was captured alive, so he was actually supposed to commit suicide if he survived a crash. Instead, he did not. The Soviets found out that he was there spying, the US actually denied it. So, and he was shot down here, obviously right in the middle of the Soviet area. So, very obvious he was not where he was supposed to be. The US says it was a weather craft. It just turns terrible because the US denies it, the Soviets have the proof, and things go very badly for us. So it really makes us look bad, and they find out for sure that we were spying. Some other actions under Eisenhower to know about and are noteworthy. In 1959, he made sure that Alaska and Hawaii were both added to the U.S. as states. That created a little buffer zone between the U.S. and communist countries. That means we can add more military to those areas. Think about where our issues were. Korea, China, the Soviet Union. We can go across the Pacific. Now we can kind of buffer up those areas. And they're states, so it makes perfect sense to be adding military to them. So that actually helps us. So Alaska is the 49th state, Hawaii the 50th. Both in 1959, but Hawaii is added after Alaska. And so in 1960, Eisenhower leaves the office of president. So he spent 8 years in office. He was proud of many of his actions, avoided war, contained communism. That was his goal. However, he had not created a lasting peace. He knew that there is not a real peace here and we need to do more. And he saw it as not really being an option at the time. Things needed to change, and he at this time was not able to do that. So now it's time for you to get out your study guide, check over your study guide, see what you know, see what you don't know, come up with what questions you want to ask in class, and we will see you in class. Make sure that you are ready for your quiz next week.